Okay, folks, I would like to finish up with our very, very slow to begin lesson number 1 and just recover some of the things that we've discussed, talk about a few important terms relating to natural resources, and then look at some ideas. I think we were talking about, we mentioned peak oil last time. Yeah. All right, so we'll get sort of into that a little bit. I'm going to probably leave most of these videos to you for you to look at, so you're probably not wondering what I'm talking about. So anyway, this is lesson number 1, okay? And on lesson number 1, I've got just a quick little reading here, pages 1 through 9 of the conservation idea. I've got a little bit of, whenever I leave BAB there, that just means I've written this stuff, so it's just my professing. Don't take it as the gospel. And I would like for you to see some of these quick videos on the history of capitalism and Adam Smith. But this one in particular is something we need to talk about because this will introduce us to some concepts called a common resource. Okay, so I'd like us to start off with that.
What is a common resource? A common resource is any good or service that is non-excludable and rival. Let's look at tuna in the ocean as an example of a common resource. The tuna are non-excludable because there are no property rights to fish in the ocean. No one can legally be prevented or excluded from fishing for tuna outside of a nation's territorial waters. Tuna are also rival. Every tuna you catch means one fewer tuna for someone else to catch. Other examples of common resources are the environment and public roads. These non-excludable and rival resources often lead to a tragedy of the commons, the destruction of that common resource. In the case of tuna, that means the collapse of the fishing stock. To learn about ways to prevent the tragedy of the commons,
and the more extensive one is this, okay? This is a little bit more involved, and what we're looking at here is, and let me try to expand this a little bit so you all can see it on that screen. I know it's impossible. Okay. Maybe you can see that. So if you can't, move up to the front. And I'll try to do what I can with this. Okay. So the tragedy of the commons is anybody ever heard of that term? Surely some of you have heard. Shirley has. Yeah. Okay. Just kidding. I'm not calling you Shirley. The tragedy of the commons is actually a paper, and maybe you've even read it, or you will, by a fairly well-known ecologist. And anyway, the idea is that it's sort of a dilemma of having a type of good that is generally referred to as a common good or a common resource. And before we get into that, we need to identify what we mean by a common good. A common good is one that is both rival and non-excludable, okay? So a rival good simply means that if one person is using it, another person cannot use it. So, or there's a limited number of people who can also use it, right? And excludable or non-excludable means that there is some mechanism that allows a resource to be cordoned off or regulated in some way or available only to those who have the ability to pay for something, okay? So that's not a very good explanation, but excludability, something that is non-excludable is basically open to anybody to use. There's no control over the use of the resource. So it's non-excludable. If something is excludable, most of the time it's identified and it has there's some sort of ownership associated with it. Okay? So private property, if you own private property, you can exclude someone coming onto your private property. That's your right as a property owner in this country. Okay? You might be able to pay, or you might be able to, you might want somebody to pay you, say, $40 to park in your yard on a football game day, all right? So your landlord might allow you to do that, okay? And that would be kind of a perk, I guess, if you owned a place near the campus. So it's excludable in the sense that you're going to only allow cars to park who pay that $40, right? It's not just a free-for-all. Okay, so excludability, non-excludability. Let's look back at rivalry and can somebody give me an example of something that can be used, something when it is used cannot be used by someone else at the same time. And anything can work, almost. It's pretty easy. And once somebody says something, why don't you tell me, just say excludable or non-excludable, okay? Public roads. I'm sorry, excludable. I'm sorry. Public roads, rival or non-rival?
Non-rival.
Non-rival. Now, given you probably have to be in a licensed motor vehicle, okay, you can't necessarily go cruising down the freeway on your skateboard, okay, or your longboard. It's pronounced, that's the name, right? So how about something else? What's something that is excludable that you can think of? Something that when you use it cannot be used by someone else.
Parking space.
Parking space, great, excellent. Now, the parking space is still there, but if somebody's using it, you're not going to be able to use it. And it's also what? It's non-excludable generally, unless there's a handicap sticker or something there. So that's a great example that I just experienced, right? So trying to find a parking space, trying to get to class on time, and so I realized I'm never going to find one close to the building, so I'll just park out there and walk, okay? So you know that's the way things work. How about some other examples? Let's say something that is non-rival. What's something that is non-rival? When you use it, it doesn't affect anybody else's ability to use it, at least immediately.
Wi-Fi?
Wi-Fi, fantastic example. All right. So if I'm using my Wi-Fi and you're using your Wi-Fi and maybe 100 of us are using the same, whatever they call those things, then it might slow down, I suppose, if you all are streaming movies and all that kind of stuff. But, for the most part, it's not something that's going to dismiss somebody else. How about, let's see, what else would be a good example? What would be a clear example of something that is rival, a good that is rival? And this can be either a service or a product, a physical good, manufactured product. What is Wi-Fi? It's kind of a service, isn't it? You're tapping into the service. How about education? Is it rival or non-rival? Or we could say, well, is higher education, is that rival or non-rival? Rival. Well, no, it's not rival, because if I get an education, that doesn't stop you from getting an education.
Well, like classes would be rival, because if the class is full, then you can't get in.
Well, my classes. But yeah, okay, I get your point. Yeah, that's to an extent true. But in terms of a college education, my getting a college education doesn't exclude you from getting a college education, or it doesn't prevent you from getting a college education. However, it might be excludable, depending on how expensive it is. So college education, or, your college course that you have to pay for it in order to have the right to sit in here, right? To supposedly rack up the credits and get your degree. So college education would most certainly, or college education would most certainly be excludable and non-rival. Okay. Okay. So you got it, I think. So let's look at some definitions here. An excludable good, the condition in which access to a good or service by consumers who do not pay for it can be prevented from using it. Things like automotive repair or Big Macs. No, you got to pay for it if you want one, unless you want to steal it. Okay, I don't know how you steal automotive repair. Non-excludable goods are goods and services in which access by consumers who do not pay for it cannot be prevented from using it. Air, public roads, knowledge, maybe Wi-Fi. Okay, so this is whatever is pretty much free and not public, or not any form of property and available for use, or at least not possibly considered property, like air. So now fresh air is not necessarily everywhere, so it might have a degree of scarcity. So anyway, a rival good is a good in which use by one person prevents simultaneous use by another person, or use by one diminishes the ability of another to use it. This is another important point. If I'm using a hammer, okay, while I'm using it, nobody else can use it. But that doesn't mean that, somebody else can't come along and pick it up and use it as well. Later, if I'm not using it. So parking space, same sort of thing. Underwear, we can share underwear, but we can't wear it at the same time, usually. So, examples. Okay, and finally, a non-rival good. Things like education. This is one, or this is maybe a non-rival good. You can use it at the same time and without diminishing the ability of others to use it, kind of like Wi-Fi, right? But one like religion, that's a perfect example, right? Now, whether it's excludable or not excludable, it depends on your denomination, probably. But, religion is not something that's going to all be used up. National defense is an interesting one because you're benefiting from it whether or not you want to have it, okay? So you may be completely anti-military and anti-aggression, et cetera, but if you're living in a country that has an adequate system of national defense, then you're benefiting from it whether you like it or not, okay? Kind of strange. Same way with democracy, okay? So if you live in a democracy, maybe you realize now that democracies aren't perhaps the perfect form of government, but who was it? Winston Churchill said, well, it's the least worst form of government. So, we'll take it for the moment until there's something better. Okay, so that brings us to combinations of different things. So a private good is both excludable and rival, okay? Your T-shirt or a cup of coffee, okay? Assuming you don't share your clothes, you share your T-shirts. You might share your cup of coffee, but, that's pretty private. Public goods, non-excludable and non-rival, that is open access roadways. By open access, I mean not a turnpike. A turnpike would be excludable, right? So a public good, public roads, public parks, again, national defense. Club goods, this is one that's kind of interesting. These are the ones that are non-rival, but they're excludable. And these are the ones that are growing right now, okay? In every form, your computer software is now becoming club goods, so that, it used to be that you paid one time and that was that, or you didn't have to pay at all, okay? And now you have all these different services that are on subscription. So lots of club goods popping up. This is kind of a growth area. goods and services that you have to pay for, but which your use does not interfere with it, with its use by others, like digital music subscriptions, your Spotify subscription, and phone service, that sort of thing. And then finally, we've got the old common goods. This is the one we're trying to get at, the one that we're really concerned about in this class. Common goods are both rival and non-excludable. They're first come, first served. And they're also of a limited supply and are essentially free to anybody who wants to take them, okay? Now, remember in the video, there was a discussion of in the video, there was a little discussion about tuna, right? And something was mentioned about territorial seas. You ever heard of that term? Geographers? What's a territorial sea? Political geography?
Isn't it like where the countries own versus what?
Yeah, a territorial sea is generally, I think it's 3 nautical miles out from the coast. Or if you have something like a bay where there's an inlet, then it's 3 nautical miles out from the coast and then across that. So anything within that is considered territorial sea. And then there's another thing called, and this is weird, but they call it the exclusive economic zone, and that's a 200 nautical mile margin from the seacoast. And beyond the 200 mile, what I'm saying is that the territorial sea is, for the most part, the same in terms of its sovereignty as the landmass, okay? So that means that other countries usually can't have to respect that territorial sea just like they would respect land territory. Then there's this kind of gray zone called the exclusive economic zone, which goes from the territorial sea boundary out to about 200 nautical miles. And that zone is mostly the rights of the country on its coast, but other countries can utilize resources, certain types of resources within that exclusive economic zone. Things like fishing are allowed by various types. A country can't say, the United States can't say, it can't tell a Russian fishing trawler that they can't ply the waters outside of the territorial sea within the exclusive economic zone. However, the United States may have special rights to claim things like seafloor minerals, like petroleum and gas, in that exclusive economic zone and exclude others. So it's really not that excludable. Now, beyond the exclusive economic zone, you have the high seas. The high seas are open range, okay? Anybody, and there's really not anything, there is to a degree what you might call maritime law of the sea, or there's maritime law in the sense of actions by people in different vessels that, piracy, for example, is not tolerated, but then there's not really a police force to enforce, an overall agreement. So it's up to individual countries to protect their own ships. So on the high seas, by the way, the high seas are one of the few places where a lot of the tuna are actually caught. Tuna are a species that are sort of a blue water species. They migrate, but much of the fishing takes place out on the high seas. So that's why tuna are in trouble in many ways. They're common goods. They're very difficult to regulate by any country. So what do countries do in order to try to keep resources, common resources like tuna, sustainable? Well, the truth is they haven't been able to do that very successfully at all until very recently. Okay, and there's some success, but it's kind of complicated. Okay, so common goods, rival. Let's have a look at the video, and I think you'll find it a nice explanation or a nice way of checking it out. And it's a little longer, but
In the final video in this section, we turn to common resources. We'll cover the tragedy of the commons and talk about some possible solutions. Common resources are those that are non-excludable but rival. Unlike public goods, common resources get depleted as more people use them. Tuna in the ocean are an example of a common resource. The tuna are non-excludable because there are no property rights to fish in the ocean. No one can legally be prevented or excluded from fishing for tuna, at least outside of a nation's territorial waters. Tuna, however, are rival. One more tuna caught leaves one less tuna for everyone else. Non-excludable but rival resources often lead to a tragedy of the commons, a destruction of the common resource. In the case of tuna, that means the collapse of the fishing stock. More generally, the tragedy of the commons is the tendency of any resource that is unowned and hence non-excludable to be overused and under-maintained. In the case of tuna, it's the stock of fish that's the common resource, and the stock is being rapidly depleted. Since 1960, the tuna catch has decreased by 75%. Atlantic bluefin tuna especially are becoming endangered. Now, nobody wants this. Tuna consumers don't want it, and neither do the tuna fishermen, whose way of life is under threat. So why is it happening? You might think the answer is obvious. Tuna is delicious. The demand for sushi is up. But that can't be the whole story. Chicken is also delicious, but chickens are in no danger of going extinct. So why the difference? Well, let's compare the incentives of Frank Perdue, the famous chicken entrepreneur, with the incentives of a tuna fisherman. If Frank Perdue harvests too many chickens today, he won't have any left to sell tomorrow, so he'll be out of business. Perdue has an incentive to preserve the chicken stock, to maintain it, so that he can continue in business into the far future. When Perdue sells less today, that's costly, but he gets the benefit of selling more tomorrow. On the other hand, consider a tuna fisherman. He knows that the stock of tuna is going extinct, but does he have an incentive to conserve? No. If he conserves and fishes less today, that doesn't leave more tuna for him tomorrow. It leaves more tuna for another fisherman to catch today. The tuna fisherman has no incentive to conserve because he doesn't own the stock of fish the way Frank Perdue owns the stock of chickens. So the tuna fisherman doesn't have an incentive to maintain the stock, and as a result we get the tragedy of the commons. The tuna stock collapses, there's no more sushi, and no more jobs for fishermen. That's a tragedy. Here's another more prosaic example. Do you have roommates? Take a look at your kitchen. That's the tragedy of the commons. There are many other examples, often from the field of the environment. The 19th century slaughter of open-range buffalo, deforestation today in the Sahel region of Africa, the hunting of elephants and rhinos to near extinction. In each of these cases, no one owned or owns the resource in question. No one could be excluded from hunting the buffalo, cutting down the tree, or killing the elephant. Thus we get the overuse and under-maintenance of the common resource. Are there any solutions to the tragedy of the commons? Let's look at three approaches: command and control, cultural norms, and creating property rights where before there were none.
Be sure.
Command and control are rules and regulations that are often used to try to limit or avoid the tragedy. But these methods are also often inefficient and ineffective. Just to give a few examples, when fishing stocks begin to collapse, the number of fishing boats is often limited, or the number of fishing days is limited. To try to save the Alaskan king crab, for example, the government imposed shorter and shorter seasons, until at one point it was legal to fish for these crabs on only 4 days in an entire year. The problem is that when the number of boats or the season is limited, the fishermen simply build bigger and better boats, boats stuffed with all kinds of fancy equipment, so that they can quickly find and harvest the fish. As a result, these regulations get more and more complex over time, with limits on fishing boat size, horsepower, equipment, and so forth.
Okay, let's take that idea for just a second. If you put a regulation like a limited season on this rival non-excludable resource, what's that going to do? What sort of incentive does that create? You just mentioned it. Well, you increase your firepower, you increase your capability, your technological innovation to do it faster and bigger is the result. So who does that, in the case of fishermen, who would that generally exclude? The regulation would generally hurt who?
Small business guys.
Small businesses, yeah. Those who didn't have the capital to invest in very large new technology, very expensive new technology. But regulations often give advantages to the largest companies, the largest corporations. Hence, large corporations are often very much in favor of regulations, while small businesses are generally against them. And so the regulation, in fact, can become such a lucrative thing that there can even be entire sectors, entire service sectors that are involved only with helping corporations get around regulations and comply with regulations, okay? So keep that in mind. The larger the operator, typically the easier to deal with a regulation, and sometimes it's just an advantage for the largest corporation.
Sometimes these limits slow the tragedy, but they usually don't prevent the tragedy. What about cultural norms? Can they prevent the tragedy of the commons? Elinor Ostrom, the 2009 winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, studied common resources throughout the world, and she discovered that the tragedy of the commons is not inevitable. What Ostrom found is that under certain conditions, norms can evolve, so that people who overfish or overgraze, they're socially disapproved. And those who contribute to the common resource, they're honored.
Okay, let's take that example, all right? Can you think of any cultural norm examples in which resources may have been made sustainable, or at least overuse was seriously discouraged of a resource because of cultural norms?
Poaching field?
Well, you tell me. Yeah, actually, that's a great one. The idea of, as we'll read when we get into wildlife, they're developed in the United States in the late 19th century, early 20th century. What's referred to as kind of a hunter's ethic. All right. And this is really only due to popular culture, okay? Popular culture in the United States got started with the Industrial Revolution. And by popular culture, what do I mean? Music, entertainment, sports, what else? You know, things that we consume, that we usually consume with our, what do you call that income? Disposable income, all right? So the Industrial Revolution was fantastic. It made everybody richer, not everybody rich, but it made everybody a little richer. And people started having, especially people in cities, started having, in the late 19th century, disposable income. They started paying for things like baseball tickets. They started paying for things like public concerts. They started paying for restaurant food, okay, for really good food at restaurants. Later on, movies, okay? So popular culture was really the thing that allowed sport hunting, okay? Sport hunting to take place, and sport fishing, for that matter. Sport fishing was a little earlier, but sport fishing and sport hunting really got started as, well, they may have been around for centuries before that, but they were always limited to the extreme upper classes, especially hunting in Europe. If you were in Germany in the 1600s, it was only one of the wealthy lords, the local the local aristocracy, who had any right to hunt. All right. And if you're in southern Germany, yeah, that was actually kind of a cool thing that the aristocracy hunted. In England, same sort of thing. You've heard of Sherwood Forest, right? Sherwood Forest back in the Dark Ages, right, or the Middle Ages, and Robin Hood was. Anybody know the story of Robin Hood? Okay, he was robbing from the rich to give to the poor. Oh, we love that, don't we? Not if you're rich, okay? He's a thief. He's called a thief. But anyway, he was actually, I think the legend goes back, he's actually a poacher, all right? So these were people who were poaching on the king's land. So there's getting back at your idea. The idea that hunting was the upper class of sport. But guess what? With Industrial Revolution and disposable income, then the common person, the masses, have access to those things that have only been available to the upper classes, like fine music, theater, what else? Good food. All these things become available to the middle class, okay? And that's when you see the rise of sport hunting as a sport, is in the mid to late 19th century. Who's the most famous big game hunter who was also a United States president? Teddy Roosevelt. Okay. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, did he come from the middle class? No. He was old silver spoon New York Dutch family. So the Roosevelts had the cash to do things like, but Roosevelt actually kind of popularized hunting in a lot of ways. Okay. Now, before, people hunted for food, and frontier settlers hunted for food, but it wasn't a sport; it was work. You had to get out and if you had to go kill a deer or two, you had to do that. But so anyway, sport hunting becomes a thing, becomes a like every other facet of popular culture. It becomes commodified. All right. What does that mean? Ever heard of that term, commodity? Commodity, commodification, commodified. Those of you who are looking at your cell phones, go ahead and look at your cell phones. I don't care. That's fine. But all of you probably have, how many of you had iTunes at one time? Oh, this is great. Okay. The people over 20 had iTunes at one time. Who has the most songs in their iTunes library? Let's see. I have probably, and I'll have to admit it. Oh man, probably like 800 or something like that. So is that a lot?
Yeah.
That's a lot of money wasted, isn't it? Granted, most of those songs were my daughter's because we had like a shared account or something, and I don't listen to 3/4 of them, okay? Because I can't understand them. She can't understand Waylon either. So anyway, I've got a few iTunes, but what happened to that? I quit messing with iTunes because I went to Spotify. All right. Now, those iTunes that you were purchasing, that was a commodity. All right. You've taken a song and sold it to you for $1.29, or if it's not very good, 99 cents. Right. So you've paid for it. It's a commodity. It's been commodified. It was it wasn't right. Well, it is rival because you can only use it on your account, right? It's a rival and it's excludable. Costs $1.29. Rival and excludable. What's Spotify? Well, I can't really go back. Remember, Spotify is a club good, right? No limitation to what you can use, and you pay one price, and so it's like a subscription. Okay. So we were talking about sport hunting as something that was that was popularized. Where did we get? How did I get there? I can't remember. What?
Cultural norms.
Cultural norms. Thank you so much. Okay, good. So cultural norms. Can you think of any examples in which culture plays a part? Okay, we're going back to sport hunting. So this ethic of sport hunting that got started, in the United States largely back in the 19th century and early 20th century. Sport hunting was really born and commodified as firearms industries and ammunition industries and subsidiary industries associated with, outfitting hunters. As those grew, also with that, clubs appeared, and some of those clubs initially were clubs to work for the interests of these sport hunters. Okay, so what do you think the first target, the first rival of these sport hunters clubs was? Back in the early, no, not PETA. Back in the early, that's a great answer. Back in the early 20th century, the sport hunters associations, and I'll say Boone and Crockett, one of the earliest environmental organizations, if you want to call it that, or conservation organizations. Boone and Crockett got started, and Teddy Roosevelt was one of its charter members. It got started in order to do what?
Hunter recruitment.
Hmm?
Was it like hunter recruitment?
Not really hunter recruitment as much as to battle the practice of market hunting. Okay? So in other words, the Boone and Crockett Club, these great white hunters, they were conservationists. They were conservationists in the sense that they put a stop through regulations. They put a stop to market hunting. I've got photographs of market hunters coming into Indian territory where it's completely unregulated, or mostly unregulated. The Indian tribes weren't very capable of. Certainly the 5 tribes weren't able to regulate hunters very much. So you would have these market hunters come in from Texas and Arkansas and who knows where else, and just slaughter deer, and they would just wipe them out and haul them back, and and the same thing with things like the passenger pigeon and egrets in Florida for women's hats, feathers for women's hats. The Carolina parakeet was completely annihilated, right? How many of you heard of the Carolina parakeet? Okay, so it was completely wiped out, mainly for feathers for women's hats because of market hunting. The Boone and Crockett Club and a few other examples were the impetus for stopping that practice. How did they do it? They did it in a number of ways, but primarily they did it by establishing a cultural norm. And that cultural norm they labeled as fair chase. You ever heard of that? Fair chase. The idea of fair chase. Somebody tell me what that means. Fair chase. It's the idea that if you're a hunter, then your number one priority is the maintenance and the preservation, the conservation of your game species, the game species that you're after. In other words, you want to be sure to make sure there's habitat for that game species, to make sure that the species isn't over harvested. These days, it's really expanded in different ways, so that now, if those of you who are deer hunters, have killed it. Let's say you've killed an 8-point buck. All right. after you kill that 8-point buck, unless you're just starving or something, the next year you might pass up the 8-point buck because you're looking for the 10-point buck. You've become pickier. You've become more selective. You've become a selective hunter. Okay. Now, if you're a fisherwoman or a fisherman, all right, you don't go out and usually catch every single largemouth bass in the pond and fillet every one of them and take them home. Okay, because there is this new ethic that came around in the 1960s called catch and release. You ever heard of that? Catch and release got started because of another organization that was started by the fishermen, the Bass Angler Sportsman Society, BASS. Anybody remember? Yep. Okay, I used to have a big sticker on my truck. BASS, and they were responsible for the much greater improvement of largemouth bass habitat around the United States and basically all over the world. All right. By the way, the largemouth bass is an invasive species around the world. Primarily in anywhere the United States military has had a base, there's largemouth bass.
Gee, I wonder how that happened.
I wonder how that happened. Yeah, and it's kind of an imperial fish, I guess, or colonialist fish, I guess. But it actually down in Central America,
Flying bass.
in Central America, they've wiped out whole populations of fish that people depended on for thousands of years. Anyway, so that's cultural. Today, a hunter would not brag on a decent hunter, an ethical hunter would not brag on killing more than the state regulation permits, right? A good hunter would not brag on breaking rules like hunting at night or using dogs to catch deer or some of the other things they used to do in the old days, hunting out of season, okay? So people who are ethical, that ethical or that hunting ethic was something that was developed and remains to a degree cultural, and not just in the United States, but throughout other countries where you have hunting, South Africa, Canada maybe. Funny thing, I was speaking with somebody from Turkey, or maybe, no, I was reading this. There's a migratory bird species that flies from northern Europe down to the Mediterranean coast. And so there are hunters in Turkey, all right? The flyway comes through Turkey. And so there's not a season, but these birds are just getting annihilated in Turkey because, there's not really much of a regulation on hunting them. So they just kill as many as they possibly can. And when I read that, I thought, what? This is crazy. Well, the United States is a little bit different in the sense that this hunting ethic or this wildlife ethic has been achieved and sort of maintained. So that was, a cultural norm. And there are a lot of other good examples, a lot of Native American examples of, you don't waste, you don't intentionally create wanton waste, right? If you're hunting. Everything that you hunt is ideally going to be used. And, there are even religious, spiritual checks against wastage of meat or of natural resources in general, okay? And I'm not speaking of any particular indigenous culture or religion at all, but just saying that this has probably evolved with our cultures, the cultures who are close to the environment, to treat the environment with respect, okay? And it doesn't matter if you're in North America or South America or Australia, or Southeast Asia, people are going to treat the natural environment with some respect. Now, let's take that down another notch. Those of you who are in zoology, how many of you are in zoology or ecology? Okay. Predators. Predators are, of course, essential to the population of the prey, right? Why is that? Well, they keep the numbers, the populations of the prey in check, supposedly. They keep them healthy too, because it's the stragglers and the animals with health problems and birth defects and everything else. Those are the ones that get chewed up first. Okay, those are the ones that don't escape from the predator. So predators are absolutely essential to healthy prey populations. Predators are also territorial, right? Predators are darn territorial. How does that affect the prey? It limits the use of the prey. When predators have territories and they protect those territories from fellow predators, whether their species or not, okay, then they're reducing the predator population, or at least they're scattering the predator population, so that the prey will not be annihilated, okay? Now what you can do is you can take the predators completely out of the equation, and then the prey population goes berserk, and you have population collapses from disease and so forth. Have you ever seen two predators of different species get into it? Like what?
Coyote and a bobcat.
Coyote and a bobcat. Who won?
Oh, they messed around for about 30 to 45 seconds. They both hightailed it.
Okay, but they don't like each other, right? Predators, I can't think of any example of two predators in the same habitat that like each other. Can you? Have you ever seen a grizzly bear get after a black bear? Oh man, grizzly bears will tear black bears to pieces, okay, and eat them. Of course, male bears will kill the young of any other rival bear. So, the territoriality of predators is a natural thing. And that's, they didn't sit around and make regulations to do that, okay? They just, in other words, they have territory. They have property rights, okay? They have property rights. Okay.
It's a free market, though, if you're willing to pay the price with your life.
Yes, exactly. It's rival and excludable to a degree.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, how did we do that? How did we do that? All right, well, I invite you to watch the second half of the video. And this is all on Canvas in the modules. So go to your modules and check things out. Did we get anywhere today? You know what the tragedy of the commons is? That's your roommate, you and your roommate and the other roommate refusing to clean the toilet, right? The dirty toilet, because everybody owns it, nobody owns it, all right? Everybody owns it, nobody's responsible